Greetings, everybody. Today we're going to talk about lumbering in the state of Michigan. So, mainly stuff that's going on in the 1800s. So, my first question to you, and what I want you to consider, is what do we need to know to tell the real story of the lumber industry in Michigan? What do you think we need to know? What do you want to know? All right, so if we want to look at the earliest days of Michigan, if we're being honest, there is nothing here. This is what Michigan looks like way back in the day. Yep, Michigan is mostly swamps and mosquitoes. Not a whole lot there. In fact, it was once said there was an old saying, "Don't go to Michigan, the land of ills." The word means ague, fever and chills. And if you want to think about what ague is, it is basically malaria, so transferred by those mosquitoes. Way back in the day, there was not a whole lot of anything here in Michigan. And so when the Land Ordinance Act of 1785 was passed by Thomas Jefferson, we start to get some interest in the land of Michigan. People start to become more and more interested in settling Michigan. Certainly, there are a lot of land speculators. Speculators, basically people who are gambling. They're coming to Michigan. They're investing money in the hopes that they can get something out of it. And one of the things that the speculators will rave about is the fertile soil in the wonderful climate. Now, as those of you who have lived in Michigan for a while know, the climate of Michigan is wonderful in the spring and it's not bad in the summer. But certainly we've got our ups and downs, and certainly the climate wasn't maybe everything that people thought it was, and the idea that the soil was fertile, it was, but not necessarily everywhere that it needed to be. So the Land Ordinance Act of 1875 basically divides the state up into 6 by 6 square mile sections. These are what today we would know as townships. So if we think about Canton Township is a true township. It is a 6 by 6 square mile. Same thing with the Township of Plymouth. It's for the most part a 6 by 6 square mile. Obviously, the city of Plymouth is within the township. But anyways, that's another story for another day. Things are divided up along Baseline Road, which today is what we would call 8 Mile Road. And it was called Baseline Road because it is the baseline from where all measurements extend. And so, as we've got these speculators and if we've got these surveyors going around, one of the things that they're doing is they're carving out pieces of land. So not only do we have these 6 by 6 square mile townships that are being formed, but those are divided into 36 sections per township. So when you buy a chunk of Michigan, you're essentially buying a perfect square. Now, when many people come to Michigan in the early days, there's not a whole lot here. Michigan is the heart of the frontier area. You can see it is very heavily forested, very, very heavily forested, like you see in the picture. Land was free after the War of 1812. So for veterans of the War of 1812, one of the payoffs that they would get is they would get free land. And if you wanted to take advantage of this free land, it's great, except it's going to be a whole lot of work. Life is going to be difficult because before you can even think about building a house or moving in or anything like that, first you've got to clear out the dense forest. You've got to cut down the logs to create the room to build your house. And this is going to be very difficult. There are not a lot of people who are going to take on the venture, and even many of those who do show up for the free land and the frontier, many of them don't make it too long. Many of them don't last because it is incredibly difficult work. It is very labor intensive, and there's not a lot of people there. One of the earliest families to settle is the Tibbs family. They were one of the earliest settlers of the township of Plymouth. And they've got an interesting story. You can read all about them. And when we go to the Plymouth Historical Museum, if we go as a class, you can learn a little bit more about the family there. But one of the things that they did is they were located pretty far away from their neighbors. I think the closest neighbor's house was something like a half mile away or 3/4 of a mile away or something like that. And so one of the Tibbets boys, one of the things that the kids used to do for fun is for work, they would chop lumber, and then for fun, they would take the wood chips from the chopped lumber and they would throw them at livestock. They would throw them at wild animals, they'd throw them at domesticated animals. I don't know why they found amusement in that, but they did. So their way of amusing themselves was to throw wood chips at some of the livestock. And one day, as J.S. Tibbs recalls, my brother and I would pick up the chips as they came from the axe and throw them at the pigs. Just as my brother was rushing to get a chip, down came the axe with a thud into his head, cutting the skull, making a wound some 3 inches in length. Yeah, he hit his brother in the head with an axe. Now, to make matters even worse, the parents weren't anywhere near there. So the first thing that they had to do is that parents were off. They were at a local meeting house, and that was maybe about a mile, mile and a half away from where they were at. So as J.S. Tibbs recalls, I took my little brother, then 4 years old, with this giant axe in his skull, by the hand, and we ran home 1/2 mile, the blood running down his face, both of us crying as hard as we could. Can you imagine that? So he accidentally hits his brother in the head with an axe, and then the little kids have to run 3/4 of a mile to get home, to get to the meeting house. Thankfully, there were a couple doctors, physicians in the area, and they were able to cure him. He did make a full recovery. So, just some of the crazy stories that happen in early Plymouth. So in the early days of Michigan, there's again not a lot there. And so the hard thing is, how do we convince people to come to Michigan? I asked you the question, why come to Michigan? Why would people want to come here? And today we're going to kind of look at some of those answers. And part of it begins with a guy named Lewis Cass. Lewis Cass is who Cass Technological High School in Detroit is named after. Lewis Cass was the first territorial governor of the state of Michigan. He would hold that role for 18 years. He gets the job after the War of 1812. He would fight in the Battle of the Thames, which is kind of an Ontario, southwestern Ontario-ish area in the War of 1812. And when that's over, he is appointed to be the governor of the state of Michigan. And one of the early things that he does when he's the governor, and again, he's the longest serving governor in state history, um, he comes up with the state motto. If you want to see the Latin, I don't speak Latin, so I'll just give you the English translation. If you see a pleasant peninsula, look about you. Essentially, what he's saying is Michigan's a great place. This is a good place to be. You should want to be here. Now, one of the things that made a lot of people, especially on the British side, not want to be, well, they're Americans by now, but formerly British, one of the things that made a lot of people not want to be here is the indigenous people. As you might imagine, some of the indigenous tribes were hostile to the European settlers and the American settlers who were coming in, trying to take over and steal their land. And so a big part of what ends up helping to build the state of Michigan is something that's absolutely horrible. You've heard of Andrew Jackson in the Trail of Tears, which is a result of the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Yeah, Lewis Cass was put in charge of maybe carrying this out. He becomes the Secretary of War after he's the governor of Michigan, and he will lead to a lot of the Indian Removal Act, kicking indigenous people off of their land. To tell you what an outstanding guy Lewis Cass was, I say that sarcastically, he wasn't an outstanding guy. Even after slavery, enslavement was made illegal in Michigan, even after it was outlawed in Michigan, he still held on to his enslaved people. So, not exactly an outstanding guy. Lewis Cass today, because he was the first governor of Michigan, he is honored in Statuary Hall in Washington, D.C. If you go on the close-up trip to Washington, D.C., one of the things we'll do is visit the U.S. Capitol. At the U.S. Capitol, every state is allowed to donate two statues, famous people from their state, and one of Michigan's is Lewis Cass. Fear not, we're trying to right a wrong, and that statue is scheduled to be removed. It's going to be replaced, so he won't be there too much longer. But needless to say, Lewis Cass kind of a mixed figure in Michigan history because he is very essential to the settlement of the state of Michigan, but on the same token, not exactly a good guy. All right, so one of the things, if we're going to get people to come to Michigan, we have to survey the land. We have to tell people what's here. We have to try to convince people of what they're going to get if they do come to the state of Michigan. And so by 1840, we see the survey of the Lower Peninsula is completed. By 1850, we see the Upper Peninsula completed. And essentially, what many of the surveyors find is on top of the lumber, and mainly there is lumber here. There are dense forests in Michigan. We've also got some minerals, and where we've got soil, the soil is pretty fertile. It will be pretty good for planting stuff. And so that helps convince people to come to the state of Michigan. Now, another thing that is going to lead us to this Michigan fever, this desire of people to come to Michigan and make Michigan more desirable, is the building of the Erie Canal. And even though the Erie Canal is not in Michigan, it has nothing to do directly with the state of Michigan. It is an important project that the government undertakes in the early 1800s. They will at the time spend over $7 million. So this is probably hundreds of millions of dollars in today's money in order to build the Erie Canal. And what makes the Erie Canal so important is the Erie Canal will connect the Great Lakes to New York State. And so when you think about New York as being one of the places to be in the world today, New York was one of those places you wanted to be in the world back then. And so by connecting New York, mainly sort of the Buffalo and Albany areas of New York, by connecting New York to the Great Lakes, that meant that it became cheaper to ship stuff from places like Michigan or Ohio or whatnot to New York. So way back in the day, if you wanted to ship something from Michigan to Buffalo, it would cost about $100 per ton. But by the time the Erie Canal is built, that cost is reduced to about $25 a ton. So when you think about a 75% reduction in price, that's going to convince people to want to build stuff. So now all of a sudden you can use the Erie Canal as a way to ship goods, and if you can do it cheaply, there is profit to be made. Well, way back in the day, you couldn't make a profit by, say, I don't know, trading lumber to Michigan. Now all of a sudden you can. And so a lot of times the boats would be pulled by either small boats, or a lot of times they would even use mules to running along on the shore that would pull the boats through the Erie Canal. And so this is, of course, going to make it easier for people to get around. The Tibbs family, as we mentioned, think about this. So the Tibbs family, when they first get to Michigan, the father actually leaves his teenage son behind and says, "Build the house, build the settlement. I'll be back in a few months. I'm going back to get your mom and the rest of the family." So if you can just imagine what it would be like to, I mean, you're all teenagers. Imagine if mom and dad just left you there for a few months on your own and said, "Build a place to live." Now, again, the other thing that makes Michigan more settleable is the Indian Removal Act of 1833. Again, this is the Trail of Tears that you've learned about in your history classes. And so this is when Andrew Jackson, with the help of Lewis Cass, will help remove, essentially kick many of the indigenous people off their land through a series of different treaties that are signed. And eventually we get, of course, as we know it, the Indian Removal Act. So, Michigan fever. I got the fever. When we talk about Michigan fever, we're not talking about literally like getting the flu and throwing up and stuff like that. The Michigan fever is actually a desire to be in the state of Michigan. In the early 1800s, Michigan is not a very desirable place to be. It is mostly wilderness. There's not a lot there. Nobody really knows what is there other than lumber, and it's hard to get the lumber before the Erie Canal is built. But then by 1836, we start to see a peak in the percentage of land sold in Michigan. So by 1836, we're going to sell in that year alone 4.2 million acres of land in the state of Michigan. And so when it comes to percentage change in the population, this is huge. To give you an idea what a big deal this is, no territory in the United States grew as fast as Michigan. Michigan was the fastest growing territory in the entire United States. Why? Because we have lumber. And what about that lumber? It's cheap, it's affordable, and now we can easily get it from Michigan to, downtown New York and stuff like that, upstate New York, so they can use it to build. To give you an example, in 1820, If you wanted to settle Michigan, it was going to cost you about $2 per acre. In 1836, it was reported that one wagon left Detroit for the interior every 5 minutes, dusk till dawn, from early spring to late autumn. Think about that. If you're having a wagon leave every 5 minutes, I mean, it's just a constant barrage of people moving into Michigan. And again, why do they live there? We've now got the land survey done that says that there are valuable minerals and lumber. We've made it affordable to ship because of the Erie Canal, and we have removed the indigenous people who might have stood in the way of what the British would call, or what the Americans at the time would call, manifest destiny. Now, obviously, we did a huge disservice to the people, and what we did to the indigenous people is just totally uncalled for. All right, so lumbering. When we talk about lumbering of Michigan, what exactly are we talking about? There are a couple different types of lumber. There is softwood lumber, and most of that is located north of the 38th parallel. Most of that is pine trees. So if we want to look at most of the upper part of the lower peninsula, and if we want to look at a good chunk of the upper peninsula, a lot of that is what is called old growth pine. Old growth are trees that are often 2, 3, 400 years old. You can see they are absolutely mammoth trees. These are trees that can be 5 to 10 feet in diameter. For scale, you can see how little the dude is compared to how big the tree is. These are trees that can grow to be probably about 300 feet tall. These are huge trees that are being cut down. So when we talk about what are we going for, we're going for pretty substantial pieces of lumber. Again, most of these trees are usually 5 to 10 feet in diameter. We're talking about a huge amount of lumber. From 1860 to 1900, Michigan was the leading lumber state in the entire United States. We were considered the leading lumber state because roughly 25% of all lumber in the United States of America came from Michigan. Think about that. 25% of all lumber coming from America in the late 1800s is coming from the state of Michigan. To give you an idea, many of us often think about the California Gold Rush, and we think about all the money that was made in the Gold Rush and all the reasons why people would go to California in the 1850s to get gold. At the exact same time that people are rushing to California for the Gold Rush, the rush for lumber is going on in the state of Michigan. And there is far more money to be made in Michigan off of lumber than there is gold in California. It is estimated that there is over $1 billion worth of lumber in Michigan at the time. This is multiple times the amount of gold that we see in the California Gold Rush. So, while gold in California might be kind of flashy, certainly Michigan is actually where the money is. If you want to make money in the 1850s, 60s, 70s, you are coming to Michigan because we got a lot of money here. Now, the one thing about the forest is there was so much lumber in Michigan. Not only was there a lot of it, but everybody considered it quote unquote inexhaustible. They thought that there was so much lumber here that we would never run out of it. And so that's another reason why people came to Michigan is for this endless supply of lumber. Now, the people who came here, this is not easy work. So the thousands and thousands of men who are going to come, they're tough men. These are well-built men. These are men who are working 14, 16 hours a day. They're working in incredibly dangerous conditions. If you want to think about the fact that you've got to move around these mammoth trees that weigh thousands and thousands and thousands of pounds, you've got to climb up them. You've got no safety equipment. These incredibly difficult jobs for people to do. So any of the early lumberjacks who come to Michigan, they're tough men. These are well-built men. They are pure muscle. The men would often build temporary camps, and usually these camps held between 50 and 70 people in a camp. They didn't build them too permanent because they knew that they weren't going to be there too long because they're going to move on to the next camp. And because it's mostly men and they're so dedicated to making money, oftentimes they're going to work long days. Again, they're going to work 12, 14 hours a day, 16 hours a day. Odds are pretty good that most of the winter they're not going to shower at all, because they're going to be too busy trying to make money. They're going to be too busy trying to cut down the lumber. And again, if we want to talk about how these men do the job, eating is incredibly important. So they end up having what is called the noonday meal. The noonday meal is incredibly important because you need a ton of calories if you're going to make this happen. If you're going to be a lumberjack, if you're going to make your money on that, you need to have a lot of calories in you. And so your typical noonday meal is going to consist of super stew. You're going to have beans. You're going to have sourdough bread. You're going to have cookies. You're going to have pies. You're going to have hot tea and maybe some coffee. And when we say this is not a buffet where you're going to get maybe just a little bit of each. You're probably consuming 5 to 10,000 calories worth of food at one of these meals. There are not a lot of women in Michigan at the time because it is frontier land, it is dangerous, it is hard work. Most of the people coming to Michigan are either single men or if they are married, they're not bringing their wives with them. Most wives would not come to the state of Michigan, at least not at the time. There were very few women at these lumber camps because it's hard work. Now, for the women who did come, most of those women would help out. They'd work out as cooks and they would help the lumber industry that way. So there were some women who were in the camps, but not a whole lot of them. All right, so cutting the lumber down is one thing. It's one thing to knock down the lumber, but then once you've cut it down, you've got to move it. And again, if we're thinking about this lumber that literally weighs thousands and thousands and thousands of pounds, these aren't trees that you're going to pick up and move on your own. Now remember, these are the days before you've got automobiles and semi trucks and all that. You don't even in the early days have trains. You don't even have steam engines. So the way they would transport the lumber is through the rivers. I think we mentioned at the beginning of the year that Michigan, when it got its name, Great Waters, part of that name comes from the fact not only the Great Lakes, but the fact that we've got an extensive river system. And so those rivers would be used in order to ship the lumber from one part of the state to the other, to get the lumber from the camps down to the lumber mill so it could be cut up and then shipped off to New York or other parts of the country. So in the winter time, when the rivers are frozen, you can't transport the lumber because the rivers are frozen. And so what they'll do is they'll just stockpile the lumber and they'll wait till the rivers melt so that they can float them down in the summer. Now, this, as you can imagine, could be kind of difficult because you've got a number of different lumbermen down there doing their thing. And, sometimes it'd be hard to tell who cut down what tree. And so, just like livestock is branded, one of the things that they would do to logs in the winter is every company had a mark, and they would put these log marks on the logs. And so, every company had a symbol, so that when the summertime came and the rivers melted and they started to ship things, they would be able to tell whose logs came from which lumber company. Now, the major problem that happens when you try to float thousands and thousands of pounds of logs through the water is sometimes you hit a low water level, sometimes you hit an obstruction, sometimes there's rocks or whatever, and when things get jammed up, that means the logs will stop flowing. And we're talking about, hundreds and thousands of tons of logs that get backed up. These are incredibly dangerous when this happens. So you do not want logs to get backed up because then they build up and they build up. And again, with the weight and the size of these things, people get seriously hurt. Not to mention you lose a lot of money whenever you've got a log jam. So the first thing you try to do is avoid the log jam in the first place. Because if you've got a log jam, usually the way that you unjam the logs, you use dynamite and you blow it up. And that's got its own risk involved with it. To prevent log jams in the first place, we've got a lot of men who are nicknamed the river pigs or river hogs. Both names are kind of used, and the idea behind this is they would essentially ride the logs to the mill. So as you can see these men in these pictures, they're going to wear shoes that have spikes on them, and essentially they're going to jump from log to log, and they're going to use those long poles in order to keep the lumber moving. And so they try to prevent a log jam before it even happens. Of course, today, there are lumber competitions and people try to balance on logs and all that kind of stuff. But back then, this was serious work. This was serious labor. The job of booming, the job of trying to keep the logs from getting jammed up, that was a very dangerous job. And it took a very highly skilled worker to run and jump from log to log to keep this stuff moving. Now, one of the things that will make the logging industry a little bit better is when railroads become more widely available. And so in the early days of railroads, railroads are incredibly expensive to build, especially a standard gauge railroad. So one of the things that gets invented is the narrow gauge railroad, which is a whole lot smaller than your standard gauge, but it's also more effective because you can build these at a fraction of the cost of what a full-size railroad would cost. And then you can also get into parts of the interior. Now you don't have to rely on the river system anymore. And so now you can go to even more remote parts of the state that are not necessarily next to a river, and you can start cutting things down. Also, because you don't have to worry about the river freezing, guess what? You can continue logging in the middle of the winter time. So this becomes a year-round project for many companies. Once you cut the lumber down, it's got to make its way to a sawmill. This is where we're going to cut the rough lumber up, and they're going to make it into boards and 2x4s and 4x4s and all the other measurements that you can think of. In 1873, there were about 1,600 log mills in the state of Michigan. By the time we get to 1893, that number's cut in half to only 800. Why? How could that happen, you might ask? Well, we get better technology. So as the saws improve, as steam-powered saws will start to improve as they build better technology, you can have roughly half as many mills, but at the same time, the output, the production, is going to, in some cases, triple, quadruple, sometimes even 7 times more lumber, even though you've got fewer mills out there processing the lumber. It is estimated that in 1873, over 3 million board feet of lumber is harvested in the state of Michigan. By the way, the measurement of a board foot, the way we come up with that measurement is you take a 12-inch wide by 12-inch wide by 1-inch thick piece of board, and that is considered a board foot of lumber. So for every 12 by 12 by 1-inch thickness piece of lumber that you've got, that is measured in a board foot. So in 1873, 3 million board feet per year. By 1893, so just 20 years later, again, if we look at that board foot, we're looking at about 10 to 20 million board feet per year. So we can see huge increases in the output. Things get really, really good for the lumber industry in Michigan. By 1897, it is estimated that we're producing about 160 billion board feet of lumber. All right, we're going to take a look at redwood logging. Redwood logging is going on in California, so the clip you're going to see is from California, but keep in mind that lumber, old hardwood growth, hardwood lumber from Michigan, the process is not going to be all that different.
The logging of California's giant redwood trees is a big job. Even before the trees are felled, a railroad has to be built to take the trees to the mills to be cut into lumber. Surveyors lay out the lines that are followed by the railroad. The ties and the rails are laid even before the trees are felled. The X means that this tree will itself be used in moving other trees as soon as they are brought down and cut into logs. The topper will cut off the top, and the tree will be rigged with cables and pulleys. For most people, a job like this would seem too dangerous, but then logging is a hard and dangerous work, and these men take pride in their strength and courage. They are the men who fell the trees and get the logs out of the wood so that we may have lumber for houses, for furniture, for the 1,000 uses of wood. And all in his day's work, over goes the top of this tree. The job of logging is well underway. Donkey engines are brought up to lift the big logs, haul them around, and place them on railroad cars. Heavy cables and huge pulleys are needed to lift logs weighing up to 50 tons. The actual felling of a tree begins with the making of a scaffold for the axemen to stand on as they work. Then they begin their cutting their way into trees that may be as old as our civilization. For the redwood trees of California are probably the oldest of living things. The redwoods that grow along the coast live to be 2,000 years old. They are young at 350 years, they are mature at 1,000 years, and they reach old age at 1,500 years.
I know I said it before, but I just want to reiterate again. There was more money in lumber in Michigan than there was in the California gold rush. That is a huge, huge, huge point. And so if we want to think about the people who got rich in the California gold rush, more people got richer in lumber in Michigan. And so we're going to talk about a couple of the lumber barons. We're not going to talk about every single one of them, but a couple of the key ones, maybe the ones that are a little bit more familiar and you'll see them around somewhere. One of them is a guy named Russell Alger. He was your rags to riches story. He was started out kind of as your average everyday guy. You know, he was just a lumberjack himself, and then he eventually ended up making his fortunes in the lumber industry. By the time he was done, you know, he started out with 100 square miles of forest, and he just kept building and building and building and buying more land, and eventually he would build his own railroad company to transport all the lumber. And from there, he would parlay that into becoming the governor of the state of Michigan. So, you know, he built a political career out of that. What he is most known for today is not even the fact that he became the governor or that he was filthy rich, but it's because of his house. His house, which is right on Lake St. Clair, is today now known as the Grosse Pointe War Memorial. So it's a banquet hall, and you can get married there, and of course it pays honor to veterans of the Great War and World War II. So that's what it is today, but needless to say, you may hear his name pop up here or there. Maybe even more famous than him is a guy named Charles Hackley. Hackley was from the Muskegon area, and he ends up building his fortune in the lumber industry. And he, at the time, was worth an estimated 18 to 20 million dollars. So in today's money, we're looking at probably 700 million dollars. And perhaps why he is known even more is not necessarily because he was rich, but because he gave back a lot of that money to the community. He was a huge philanthropist. You know, he donated in his lifetime about 12 million of that 18 million back to the city of Muskegon and the surrounding areas. Today, if you go to Muskegon, just about everything in the town is named after him. The school system is named after him. There's a library named after him. You can see that in the photo. There's parks named after him. The hospital in Muskegon is named after him. So everywhere you go in Muskegon, you can see traces of Hackley and his wealth. Another famous one, and maybe the one that you're most likely to encounter, is David Whitney Jr. He ended up buying a bunch of pine trees, and he would sell the pines for about 100 times of what he paid for them. So he's going to make a ton of money. And then he's going to turn around and he's going to reinvest that money in real estate. And he's going to buy up buildings and build buildings on the most famous street in Michigan at the time, you know, that now is known as Woodward Avenue. Of course, we talked about who Woodward was a little bit earlier, the Augustus Woodward, who laid out the city of Detroit after the Great Detroit Fire. And of course, he's probably most famous for the Whitney buildings. He built part of Grand Circus Park. And, you know, today, if you go to the Whitney building, they're still there. Again, they're on Grand Circus Park. We talked about that before as well. Today, there's a bunch of fancy restaurants on the inside. There's a hotel inside. There's offices. So quite the building today. And then there's his house. In the year 1900, he was the wealthiest man in all of Michigan, and certainly the wealthiest man in the city of Detroit. Probably the thing he is maybe most famous for is the house that he built. In the year 1900, David C. Whitney was the wealthiest man in Detroit. They estimate he was worth about $15 million at the time. So, you're looking at probably 60 to 100 million in today's money. And he ends up building this house that overlooks the Detroit Athletic Club, which is still around today. The Detroit Athletic Club is a very prestigious social club in Detroit. Costs a lot of money to join today. So he wanted to have his property overlooking the Detroit Athletic Club property. So he built the house, which at the time cost him about 400 grand to build this mansion. Today the mansion is worth probably several $1 million. And today the mansion is not a mansion anymore. In fact, for a while it kind of fell into disrepair before it eventually gets bought up and turned into a restaurant. And so today, one of the nicest restaurants in the city of Detroit is the Whitney. You can eat in his house. There are a lot of rumors that the place is haunted. I've never seen any hauntings there, but it is an upscale restaurant, and it's a really nice place to go today. Not too far from the Detroit Symphony and many of the Wayne State, many of the things going on in downtown Detroit. So every now and then, I like to go there and just check out the Whitney and have a good meal. Now, along with all the good stuff that comes along with the lumber industry, there are some negative effects of the lumber industry, and that is wood burns. So fire ends up being a big problem, and some of the worst years for fires in Detroit, usually happen when we have a really, really dry summer, extended periods of drought. We've got heavy winds. So years like 1871, 1881, 1909, and 1911 were just some of those years. And so, heavy winds and drought, that's bad enough as it is, but then factor in the idea that you've got these sawmills that are operating all over the state. And when you have sawmills, you're going to have a lot of branches that are left behind. You're going to have dead wood, dead branches. You're going to have bark. You're going to have unused wood. You're going to have untreated wood. And when all this stuff is just kind of laying around and gets dried out, it's more likely to catch on fire. Add to that the fact that many of the trees, when they were cut down back in the day, weren't replanted, and that's going to make the winds even more powerful. It's going to allow the fire to spread even more. And so when they're cutting down much of the lumber, some of the unwanted parts are left behind, and that stuff catches on fire. Probably the most famous fire that many of you may be familiar with is the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, started by Miss O'Leary's cow, if you will.
The Great Chicago Fire started the evening of Sunday, October 8, 1871, and burned until the morning of Tuesday, October 10th. It spread quickly to the north and east, crossing the river, and finally destroying an area of the city 4 miles long and 1 mile wide. The fire killed an estimated 300 people and left 100,000 people homeless. Roughly 1/3 of the city lay in ruins. Those who survived the Great Chicago Fire never forgot what they'd been through. The blaze produced countless tales of bravery and heroism, but the fire also changed the way that firefighters and public officials thought about fire safety. Lauren Tarshis is the author of the I Survived series. One of her recent books is I Survived the Great Chicago Fire. She sat down with Casey Grant from the National Fire Protection Association to discuss one of the most famous fires in American history.
Today, I'm so excited to be here with Casey Grant from the National Fire Protection Association. So how did the fire really start, Casey?
In the case of the Great Chicago Fire, there was a lot of fanfare over Mrs. O'Leary's cow kicking over the lantern.
The legend is that Mrs. O'Leary's cow in a barn kicked over a lantern, and that caused the entire fire. And poor Mrs. O'Leary and her family had their lives ruined because of this.
We do know that the fire started at that location, but how it started, the official cause of that fire is unknown.
We do know there was a terrible drought. The entire city was made of wood.
Not just the buildings, but sidewalks.
Right.
Sawdust was even used to try to help control the dust in the roads. It really created a very flammable situation.
It was really a disaster waiting to happen.
So the fire started on that Sunday evening, the conditions weather-wise were not good.
Right, hot and windy, right?
That's right. They actually had several fires in the days and weeks preceding, including a very major fire. I believe it was the day before.
The day before, and it exhausted all of the firefighters.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
By the time they were set up and really began to fight this fire, it had already gotten tremendous headway and was sweeping through the neighborhoods, and they were really outgunned from the very beginning.
Right, because the firefighters at the time, of course, didn't have fancy fire engines and...
Well, they had horse-drawn
yeah.
steamers
Right.
using coal to run the pumps. It was a much different technology than what we have today.
There are many diary entries and letters written by people who survived that fire that day. People described looking up and it was almost beautiful in a horrifying way, that they would look up at the sky and it almost looked like it was filled with fireflies or fireworks. And those were these embers that were being driven by the wind and setting fires all over the city.
Right, and from the standpoint of the firefighters, they can make a stand and try to have a line of defense at the river or wherever, but the embers are just blowing right over them and they can't keep up with it.
So Casey, how did people survive this terrible fire?
In any disaster like this, people survive any way they can. Situations like a great fire that's moving along, chasing them, refuge in some cases would be in the river or Lake Michigan. Really, anywhere you could go to get beyond it or get to the outskirts of town. Most people were able to get out of the way and survive,
Right. So
except for those few unfortunate people.
One of the reasons why we remember the Great Chicago Fire, why it is really the most famous fire in American history, is because of how it has changed the way we build cities.
We build our cities today with fire protection in mind, and people don't even realize it. The width of streets are put in not only for convenience of vehicles and so forth, but as fire breaks.
Right.
They're natural fire breaks. The exterior of the buildings are much more fire resistant in terms of design. We want to keep fires confined to the building of origin if it does occur, and not spread from building to building to building like we've seen in some of these great fires.
So tell me about Fire Prevention Week.
Fire Prevention Week is celebrated every year in the beginning of October in recognition of the noteworthy disaster that happened.
Okay, so the Great Chicago Fire, easily the most famous fire in American history. But it's not the worst. In fact, not only is it not the worst fire in American history, not even close, it's not even the worst fire on October 8th, 1871. There was a worse fire that took place on the exact same day. And that fire is the Great Michigan Fires of October 8th, 1871. This is a collection of fires that will take place across the state of Michigan. Technically, it's 3 separate fires that are going to take place, and they're going to take place on the same day as the Great Chicago Fire. They're going to hit the Holland area, the Manistee area, and the Peshtigo area. Altogether, the Great Michigan Fires are going to claim over 2.5 million acres. Some would say even more than that, depending on the estimates. But this would be a huge, huge loss. More area is wiped out in the Great Michigan Fires than in the Great Chicago Fires, but it's just not as famous because it's not Chicago. For example, the Great Peshtigo Fire, which takes place on that day in 1871, it's going to take place in parts of Michigan's Upper Peninsula and then also in the state of Wisconsin. And in that part alone, we're going to have 1.2 million acres of land that gets destroyed. It's estimated that between 1,500 and 3,000 people will die. That's more than 5 times as many people die in the Great Chicago Fire. Yet, we don't necessarily remember it because, of course, Chicago rebuilds to become the great city that it is. And, areas like Peshtigo still remain relatively unknown.
You might have heard of the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, a fire so terrible that it burned 3.3 square miles from the center of the city of Chicago, caused an estimated $222 million in property damage, left 100,000 people homeless, and killed 300, all caused, according to a legend that's actually never been proven, by Mrs. O'Leary's cow. You might even think that the Great Chicago Fire was the worst, deadliest fire in American history. And you might be surprised to find out that the Great Chicago Fire wasn't even the worst, deadliest fire in the American Midwest on that day. The news of the Great Chicago Fire overshadowed the news of another fire in a little town in Wisconsin called Peshtigo, just 250 miles away, that occurred on the exact same day, October 8th, 1871. And so today we are going to remember the victims of the Great Peshtigo Fire, the deadliest fire in United States history. Settlement in the area began in the 1830s, with the first sawmill built in the town in 1836. Originally, the town was called Clarksville, but in 1858 it was renamed Peshtigo for the nearby Peshtigo River, a tributary of Green Bay. The great wealth of the area is in lumber. The area was heavily forested with white pine, and white pine is great for lumber. White pines can grow 120 to 170 feet tall. They are 6 or more feet around. They're very straight. They don't have branches for the first 3/4 of the tree. The wood, when cut, is unpalked, and one white pine can produce enough lumber to build a good-sized house. And when cut, white pine floats easily, which is where the Peshtigo River comes in, because the lumberjack could just haul the trees to the river and float them downriver to the lumber mills in the city of Peshtigo. The town had a rich benefactor, William Butler Ogden. Ogden had made a fortune in railroads and had been the very first mayor of the city of Chicago. And he recognized the value of the trees around Peshtigo and decided to invest there, creating the Peshtigo Company. He built a lumber mill, and he also built the Ogden Woodware Company, a factory that built every sort of wooden implement from axe handles to clothespins. It was the largest factory of its kind in the country. In 1871, Peshtigo was a booming town. It had all the things that you would have in a lumber boom town, from schools to brothels, from churches to banks. It had a population of 1,700. A good-sized metropolis for its day. Fire was always a risk in a lumber town, but in the great northern forest, it was usually quite wet, and so forest fires would burn themselves out quickly. But this was not a normal year. The forests of Wisconsin and upper peninsula of Michigan had faced a great drought in 1871. Winters there would usually produce 4 or 5 feet of snow, but the winter of 1870-71 had produced hardly any. The normal spring rain showers had been brief, and there hadn't been a good soaking rainstorm since mid-July. With the exception of just one shower in September, on October 8th, Peshtigo had not seen rain for 11 weeks. The forest floor was covered with the tender, dry needles dropped by stressed trees, and there was a lot of brush from the lumber work and from clearing land for the railroads. No one knows what started the fire, but fire was commonly used to clear land for farming, or to clear brush for logging, or to cook, or to stay warm. Fires were used everywhere, and fires were commonly left unattended. On October 8th, a cold front was coming down from Canada. It ran into a warm front that came up from the southern United States. The difference in temperatures was as much as 40 degrees, and the two crashing together created hurricane-force winds. The town of Peshtigo was built almost entirely out of wood, including the bridge that connected the two parts of the town that were on either side of the Peshtigo River. The fire moved so fast that there was no time to escape. Pushed by 100 miles per hour winds, it created something called a firestorm, a fire so hot that it creates its own wind system. Described as nature's nuclear bomb, it could burn as hot as 2,000 degrees. Something called a convection column rose up and created what was described as a fire tornado. People rushed to the bridge, hoping that the fire would stop at the Peshtigo River, but it jumped the river and burned both sides of the town, and then it burned the bridge covered with people. Many tried to escape by jumping into the frigid waters of the Peshtigo River, but the fire was burning so hot that you had to be underwater or you'd be burned, and so many of those drowned. Others died of hypothermia in the 40-degree water. Only a few who made it to the river and some who made it to a lower-lying marshy area on the south end of town survived. And in the morning, they found some 1,100 bodies, many more presumed to be dead. Estimates of death in the fire range as high as 2,500, but it's impossible impossible to tell because the records in towns like Peshtigo and Brussels and a dozen other small towns that were destroyed in the fire were all destroyed. And so no one really knows how many died, many times the number that died in the fire in Chicago. Many of the bodies were burned beyond recognition. Sometimes the only way you could tell that it was human remains was because there was the melted remnants of a belt buckle or a wedding ring. Some people were presumably burned to ash and simply blew away. Still others were overcome by poisonous gas or suffocated by the heat of the fire, and the bodies were found apparently untouched by fire. 350 were buried in a mass grave, unidentifiable, some simply because every person on earth who could identify them also perished in the fire. Every building in the town of Peshtigo was gone. The fire burned some 1.2 million acres before it burned itself out. The survivors did get help from nearby communities and the state of Wisconsin, but since Peshtigo was some 2 days from the nearest telegraph, the news only slowly eked out and was overshadowed by the news of the Great Chicago Fire, a fire with far fewer casualties but more witnesses. The town of Peshtigo still survives. It was rebuilt, had about 3,800 residents as of the 2000 census. There is a museum there, just off of U.S. Highway 41, that remembers the victims of the fire and keeps some artifacts. The mass grave of the 350 unidentified victims of the fire is adjacent to the museum. It's hard to divine some great lesson from the Peshtigo fire, except maybe people whom history forgot deserve to be remembered. Certainly we've gotten better at fighting fires and preventing fires and disaster relief, but disasters still occur and people still die. The people of Peshtigo, who at the time were living on the edge of civilization, knew that that offered some risk, and maybe that risk seemed small to people who would take on the dangerous job of cutting and milling lumber, jobs so dangerous that people died every day. But it's not like they were fools. It's not like they were even unprepared. It's just that all the conditions for a disaster came terribly together that day. And maybe that's the great lesson, that you can't take anything in this life for granted.
So there you have it, the Great Peshtigo Fire. One last one that we're going to talk about took place on a day that was named Yellow Tuesday because it looked like it was twilight at noon. There was so much smoke and fog and just a mess of everything in the air with the Great Thumb Fire of 1881. It was nicknamed a demon in the gale. This is going to burn over 1 million acres. There are going to be over 3,000 buildings destroyed. The damages amounted to about $2.3 million at the time, pretty close to $100 million in today's money, and that makes this the worst fire in Michigan history. It's going to leave about 15,000 people homeless. Just shy of 300 people will die. And again, if we start to think about modern firefighting, many of the plans that are used by firefighters today, they come from what we learned in the Thumb Fires of 1881. Another interesting thing about the Thumb Fires is that this was the first time that the American Red Cross responded to a crisis. So the American Red Cross would come out and they would respond to the fires, trying to help out and help people after the fires. And so this is something that we see pretty significant. So if you ever make it to Jeopardy, there's your interesting fact of the day. Again, we're just going to quickly cover the legacies. So, when we look at sort of the largest wildfires in U.S. history, and then the most who died, certainly the Great Michigan Fires that take place on the same day as the Great Chicago Fire end up being way worse than many others. When we talk about the forest in general, so we go back to the idea that originally the supply of lumber in Michigan was seen as inexhaustible, as in we could never use it all up. Well, in 100 years, we would knock out about 33 million acres. And so when we look at that original old growth forest, we were able to cut down 92% of it. So there's not a whole lot of it left. What is left is the Hiawatha National Forest. So there have been recent efforts to preserve the land, but certainly, the damage has been done, and obviously Michigan is not as heavily wooded as it was back then. That doesn't mean that we don't have a lot of beautiful forests. It just means the state has changed a lot in the last 150 years. All right, that's all I've got for you today. As always, I didn't come up with all this stuff on my own. Lots of other people did the research, the pictures, and whatnot. I just put it all together and told this story. The end. Have a great day.